Good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of our second annual Inclusive Excellence Week. Folks are logging on, and so we will go ahead and get started since we're pretty much right at time. Again, I'm Dr. Carlos Smith. I'm our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as our Director of Ethics Curriculum, and an Associate Professor in the Department of Dental Public Health and Policy. It's my honor to have coordinated the week's events with our School of Dentistry DEI committee. I'm really excited about our topic this afternoon, where we'll be talking about equity and trauma-informed practice. We have with us an expert in that arena. Her name is Melissa-Irene Jackson. She is actually a VCU grad, so we're always excited to have fellow Rams be able to share their expertise with us. She graduated from VCU's Clinical Social Work program with a focus in gendered violence intervention, and began her career with YWCA of Richmond with working with therapy clients who have experienced sexual assault, intimate partner, or dating violence and other forms of trauma. Currently, she is the Trans Healthcare Senior Manager at the Virginia League for Planned Parenthood. And so I give you none other than Melissa-Irene Jackson. Thanks for being with us today, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and thinking of me and this opportunity. I'm so excited to have this conversation with y'all. So here's a little bit about how today will work. I've got the chat open and Dr. Smith's going to help monitor it for me. I'll have some questions for y'all where your participation is helpful. And so if you're in a position where you're able to chat and respond to some short questions, sometimes just a yes or a no, that'll be great. Going to cover a lot of ground in this session and also try to leave time for questions. I also see in attendance, Abby Kinnebrew is here. It's lovely to see you. It's been a while. What an honor to have you in my audience after my program in the MSW program. So real quick, raise your hand if, and I can't see y'all. So just in the chat, you can just type yes or no. First question, raise your hand if you've ever enjoyed conversations with older adults because of their age. Sure, I have. Raise your hand or type yes in the chat if you've ever held doors open for people based on their perceived age. Or when you find out an old person's age, you say, you don't look that old. Well, I'm turning 37 at the end of the week, and people tell me all the time that I don't look 37, whatever that means. I think it's fine to look 37. I feel good about my age, but raise your hand if you've ever asked an older adult for advice because of their age. Or if you've ever talked louder or slower to an older person because of their perceived age. Have you ever avoided an old person because of their age? Maybe not sat next to them on the bus or in the waiting room at the doctor's office. Have you ever thought to yourself, when a slow driver is in front of me, it must be an old person, it must be someone's grandmother. Or heard someone address an old woman as young lady or an old man as young man. Yeah, I know I've done probably almost all of those at one point in my 37 years, maybe. Yeah, not proud of all of those, right? But so why are we talking about this? It's because we're talking about ageism, and this is an abbreviated version of the ROPE survey, which is relating to old people evaluation. And I don't like reading to people from slides, but I think this definition is really helpful. So ageism, stereotyping of older adults based on chronological age, a form of prejudice and discrimination similar to racism and sexism, allowing younger generations to view older adults as separate from mainstream society. This came up in a meeting sometime last year internally at my clinic, where someone pointed out that unless you're part of an older demographic, we often don't have many social connections, many friends, people that we hang out with regularly who are older adults, unless it's through work or relatives, right? And so we have a real segregation of age in our society too. Ageist language and imagery often leading to stereotypes of older adults. And so one of the really important things here is that we have a dynamic where even these positive things, so asking someone for advice because of their age, might not feel good to the older adult. if they're being singled out or treated differently. And that's the thing here. Even when we think we're acting positively, when we other people, we cannot value youth without devaluing old age. Think about the beauty industry. We spend billions of dollars as a society every year with wrinkle creams and things to push back the signs of aging, dyeing your hair so it doesn't look silver or gray, right? Lots of things. So ageism includes stereotypes and attitudes as prejudice, personal discrimination, not sit next to the old person on the bus, and institutional discrimination. Maybe you don't hire an older adult because you don't want to pay them more, or you're worried they'll retire a lot sooner and you won't get as long institutionally out of them. Those are all forms of ageism, and they show up in different ways at different times. The assumptions we make, the way we behave individually, and also the way our institutions respond. So if we're talking about equity and trauma-informed practice and LGBT folks, why are we talking about ageism? Well, ageism is a form of implicit bias that transcends all cultures and societies, right? Universe willing, we should all grow old into a nice golden year. And that's true of all cultures, of all societies across countries. And so it doesn't require a lot of explanation, right? How do we regard our older adults? So think about that and hold that for a little while, because we're going to circle back to that towards the end of this conversation. But a real quick disclaimer before we talk about trauma-informed practice. So it's impossible and at least difficult to talk about trauma-informed practice without talking about trauma. And today we'll be relying on some broad examples of many ways a person can experience trauma. Now, part of this work, one of our 4 R's is to minimize the risk of re-traumatizing people. And I'm not going to be going into detail about traumatic events, but if we talk about something that cues a response in you because you or someone close to you has had that similar experience, well, I can't see you on your camera, so do whatever you got to do to take care of yourself. But I hope that you will trust me to be a good steward of the topic and not go into the details of trauma if we don't have to. So we're going to keep it surface level. So if I could see you all, I would ask how many of you know about trauma-informed practice in a way that like you could really explain. Usually when I ask that question, I get a mix of answers. But in my experience, a lot of people have heard about it. It sounds great, but couldn't lead a workshop on it or write a paper on it without doing a lot of research. It's become kind of a buzzword. It sounds great on paper, but what does it actually mean to practice being trauma-informed? You'll notice the word practice is here instead of trauma-informed care, and that's really intentional because care implies patient experience, client experience, and that's part of it. But practicing trauma-informed work starts internally. It starts between you and your colleagues and your coworkers and your supervisors and your direct reports and everyone else in the organization. If we're not doing it internally, then we've already failed when we're trying to do it with clients. And so the CDC defines trauma-informed practice as a strengths-based service delivery approach grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma, emphasizing physical, psychological, and emotional safety. Someone once told me they felt psychological and emotional was redundant or they were synonyms. I disagree. For both providers and survivors, that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. That word survivor is most commonly used in spaces where we're working with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. But when we're thinking about people who experience systemic oppression or prejudice, LGBT folks, trans folks, I would say that they're also survivors of that discrimination, with acknowledgement that some people don't make it. There's a lot of violence against people who are different in our society. And so trauma-informed practice is ultimately about giving them a sense of control and involvement and empowerment in the spaces they occupy. And so if we're not doing that for our coworkers, if we have a really sexist or racist or transphobic workplace, then it feels really disingenuous to care a lot about how that happens with patients, but not our colleagues. So that's trauma-informed practice defined by SAMHSA. And this is from a 2014 document, which I sort of regard as the Bible of trauma-informed practice. So a formula. We're talking about equity today, right? There's a whole series of talks, which I'm honored to be a part of this week. But so a lot of this is based in like you see the equity, the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Those 3 prongs. So diversity is the passive observation. Richmond's always been diverse. VCU's always been diverse. Good for us. What do we do about it, right? Inclusion is a verb. It's active. It's not passive. Diversity is an observation, just like there's water on my desk, right? What are we going to do about it? Trauma-informed practice is an equation that we solve with equity being the goal. I know there's a lot of wonderful equity work being done that doesn't have any like deliberate incorporation of trauma-informed practice, but I feel strongly that these are two sides of the same coin. And hopefully by the end, I will have convinced you that that's true. So we define trauma-informed practice, but before we talk about what this actually looks like, we have to define trauma. We probably all have ideas of what trauma is when we think about it, but how we actually operationalize it is really, really important because trauma is actually really subjective. And so once again, I don't like reading to you, but I'm going to real quick. SAMHSA defines trauma. So individuals, so if I experience trauma, if you experience trauma from an event, a series of events, or set of circumstances. So if we break that down, that could be, I was in a car wreck. That could be, I was in multiple car wrecks or a set of circumstances, like being a young child growing up with a parent who has severe untreated mental illness, or domestic violence in the house that a child is observing, right? Research has demonstrated that children witnessing domestic violence can be just as traumatic, whether or not they are being physically harmed in the process, or if they are just watching a parent be harmed or a sibling. So that's a circumstance and maybe not an event because it's happening over the course of years or a lifetime, experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. So again, think about something that you're witnessing. It's not directly harmful, but it is emotionally painful and difficult or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects. So Dr. Smith and I could be on our way to lunch to get some food in the car, and we could get into a car wreck. Maybe he is just like not that shaken up by it. I have trouble sleeping later that night because I was in a car wreck in 2013. And people might say, what, that minor fender bender? That's what's gotten you so shaken up? It's like, well, yeah, because you don't know what my past is like, right? So, and then finally, lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So when we think about going back to the domestic violence example, I'm always quick to point out when talking about these things that the majority of behaviors someone might exhibit in an abusive relationship are actually not against the law. You can psychologically or verbally abuse someone, and as long as they're over 18, you're not breaking any laws. Once you physically hurt someone or sexually assault them, you have violated the law, but the law doesn't really take into account verbal abuse or emotional abuse or gaslighting someone. It might be used in a case for a protective order to demonstrate behaviors that are abusive, but there's not a law that you're breaking. It's very subjective, but we can recognize that it can still affect someone mentally, socially, emotionally. There does not need to be physical harm for trauma to occur. And so once again, the subjectivity of trauma, part of this is removing ourselves from the equation and not whether or not we would find a specific circumstance or event or experience to be traumatic to us, although we often rely on those things to anticipate not re-traumatizing people. So it's tricky, right? There's a foundation where we can anticipate things based on what is widely considered, oh, you should definitely avoid doing that. But we also need to create space to learn from people and believe them when they tell us that they've experienced a trauma. So, as I said before, trauma is both anticipated and unpredictable, and it is subjective. It is also neurological, especially depending on a variety of things. So, history, culture, race, gender, sexuality, age, class, language, religious or spiritual beliefs, education, developmental age. So think about a young child living with a parent who has untreated mental illness, who is, unreliable. Maybe there is emotional neglect. Maybe there is never enough food in the house. And when your home space is not a safe space, when you are always on edge, wondering if you are going to be in danger when you come home from school, that means that the stress response, the fight-flight response is overstimulated. That affects our neurology and cognitive development. And so someone growing up in an environment like that, we will later talk about how we classify these things as adverse childhood experiences. which is not the only form of trauma, but it's a really significant one that can set people up for difficulty later in life. So imagine we have two people in the same household. You or someone you know may have experienced exactly what I'm about to say. You know, two siblings grow up approximately the same age and have very different perspectives on their parents. Our dad was a jerk. What do you mean? He was the best father we could ask for, based on individual circumstances, potentially gender. There could be things that happen behind closed doors, private conversations, certain expectations based on being the first child, all kinds of things. I already gave you the example of us being in the same car. What if it's the same word? While I was putting this presentation together for you all today, I was thinking a lot about the word queer. My partner works in a hospital and is part of an LGBT liaison task force. And someone sent an email out to 80 staff members saying, you know, what are we doing to support queer patients? And someone in the chain took a lot of offense to that. And they're like, I really hope that that was a typo. But the word queer has been reclaimed by the community in 2021 and is so embedded in the culture that it's often the default word that we use. People often use it interchangeably to saying LGBT as a catch-all for anyone who's not cisgender or heterosexual. But there's also older adults who have only heard that word used in harmful ways, who will never hear that word in a positive way. I remember that there's a section of the Huffington Post, the online newspaper, that used to be called Gay Voices. And maybe in 2016, they changed the title of it to Queer Voices, and their editor resigned in protest because as an older adult gay man, he's like, I've only ever heard that word as a slur before I got my ass kicked in the 80s when he would face physical violence trying to walk around his city. And so the same word, there are also words that have been reclaimed by racial communities that some people feel strongly about using within that community, but other people within those communities may not like at all, right? So even the same words that we use may have different meaning to people and different traumas associated with them. What about workplace? So the experience of your workplace, depending on whether you are male presenting or female presenting, whether you are white or Black or Hispanic or Latinx, right? How does that impact your experience of the workplace? All of these things. What if you have religious beliefs that, you know, you believe based on your religion and your faith and your culture that if you are not a virgin before you are married, then that has implications for your marriage. What if someone with those beliefs experiences a sexual assault compared to someone who doesn't? The level of trauma that you experience in relation to those cultural beliefs and what type of value you place on that experience is different. And we may not have a appreciable understanding if we're not from their background, right? And so the same trauma, different experiences. And maybe not even the same trauma because everyone's trauma is unique. So feel free if you have questions or thoughts along the way to type them in the chat. I am keeping an eye on it. So we've got key principles, and these were developed in the 2014 document with SAMHSA. And, you know, whenever I see these in a presentation space, they're often just bulleted the way I have them right here. But honestly, I think it's so worthwhile to dig into them because they're not as self-evident as one would think. I honestly think we could spend an hour talking about each one. We're not going to, but we could. So the first key principle. So I've got two different organizations with citations here and just some excerpts. One is from the 2014 SAMHSA document. One is from a 2020 publication called Everyone Can Be Trauma Informed, which was written in part by a woman named Joanne Schleidel, who is partnered with the federal government in a lot of work that she's done in trauma-informed care and worked closely with federal organizations that are promoting trauma-informed care. And so I think it's important to have the two different perspectives and phrasings, because hers is a bit more holistic and approachable. But again, the SAMHSA document to me is always the reference one. So right there in the safety definition, throughout the organization, staff and the people they serve, staff come first. If we're not doing it internally, we're not doing it in our public facing space, physically and psychologically safe. The physical setting is safe and interpersonal interactions promote a sense of safety, Raise your hand if you've ever been in a workplace where you did not have a sense of psychological safety. That might mean not telling your supervisor that you think they're wrong or that they made a mistake, or speaking up during a meeting if you don't think they will take you seriously. If you've previously behind closed doors experienced prejudicial language towards your race or your gender or other things. Maybe you overhear conversations at the water cooler that leave you feeling not as welcome as you thought. So when we're thinking about organizational culture, you know, it's everyone's responsibility to cultivate it, but it's most important for people in positions of leadership to cultivate it, right? So it's a group thing. And then for the second one, while physical safety is the experience of being free from physical harm, emotional or psychological safety is the personal perception of being free from harm. Includes coercion. Pardon me for a second. I have a program on my computer making noises, and I'm going to turn it off. Back in business. So yeah, free from coercion, harassment, intimidation, bullying, humiliation, and discrimination. Those things right there can happen in an instant, can happen in an instant. And I bet that all of us in the course of our careers in certain institutions, we have observed this kind of thing happening at some point. And if we're not promoting psychological safety, we're not being trauma informed. So I have a question for thought down here. How does an organization which does not provide direct service, if you don't see patients or clients or provide, you know, like therapy or doctor's visits, engage in trauma-informed practice? Well, all this internal stuff, right? Every organization that has any kind of leadership body, or even if you have a collective leadership, there's like where there are human beings, there is potential to have people not feeling psychologically or emotionally safe, for there to be the presence of coercion, harassment, intimidation, bullying, humiliation, and discrimination, right? And so this work, one of the reasons we call it practice and not care is because it's for all organizations. It's not just for patient-facing, public-facing orgs, right? It doesn't matter what your product or service is, what your purpose for existing is. Principle 2, trustworthiness and transparency. This is so important. So have you ever been in an organization where a really unpopular decision was made? Whether it was budget cuts or changes to services or end of year bonuses or downsizing, who was involved in that decision making? Did they ask you your opinion? If they did ask your opinion or input, did they demonstrate that they valued it? Did they integrate it in, or did they disregard it? I've seen both happen in the course of my life. So SAMHSA defines this by saying, in part, operations and decisions are conducted with transparency, with the goal of building and maintaining trust. In my experience, even if unpopular decisions are being made, if we're transparent about why they're being made, you know, we did the best we could with what we had. We would have liked to have done better, but this is what we got, and here's how we got here, right? Versus this thing is changing in a way that is detrimental to us or limits our ability to do our job or makes our job harder, and we're not even being giving a good reason why. Transparent communication, especially when it involves addressing uncertainty, confusion, and pain, is vital for creating safe and supportive relationships. So if we're not being transparent in our decision-making to the extent that we're able to, then we're not creating psychological safety, right? Trust is unlikely to develop when communication is limited or unclear. And so you'll see these principles build upon one another, but they're also not linear. They complement each other, and they all have to be present for trauma-informed practice to be working. So peer support most commonly is discussed in the context of, like, let's say you're doing mental health work, and maybe you're working with survivors or you're working with substance abuse or veterans. Having someone who has been through that process, who is recovered or has been in recovery for a long time, peer support can go a long way because it levels the playing field. Hey there, I've been where you are, right? Mutual self-help, key vehicles for establishing safety and hope, building trust, enhancing collaboration. You ever have someone say, you don't know what it's like to be me. You don't know what it's like to have an abortion. You don't know what it's like to be struggling with substance abuse, right? And if you can say, oh, you know, actually, I do. Or there's someone there who can provide that support. can go a long way. I think peer support in general is really important just for dealing with life. I always refer parents of trans kids to peer support spaces to talk with other parents, because we don't really have a social schema for how to navigate that if the people in your life don't know how to talk to you about it. And then our 2020 publication, Everyone Can Be Trauma Informed. Ethical and compassionate transparency is the most direct route to consideration and development of trustworthiness. I think it conveys respect to be transparent with people because it's about honesty, right? We are including you in this conversation. We want to hear what you think. We're going to value that feedback and incorporate it to the extent that we can. So looking at the next one, collaboration and mutuality. Now this one is the one that benefits the most from being spelled out and talked about, because collaboration sounds obvious. We should collaborate together. That's not what this means. Importance is placed on partnering and the leveling of power differences between staff and clients and among organization staff, from clerical and housekeeping personnel to professional staff to administrators. What this means is a key tenet of trauma-informed practice is that we level power dynamics. If your staff are afraid to speak their mind when the head of your department is in the room during a meeting, then we are not practicing collaborative mutuality. We're not doing it. If that power dynamic means that this other person is so important that I don't even feel comfortable expressing my opinion or asking a question for fear of drawing attention to myself, right? And sometimes there's a time and a place, right? But this is really, really important. And the idea that even the clerical and housekeeping personnel, their opinions matter. We should ask them how they're doing, and not in a, hey, how are you? Have a good day, right? These are about meaningful relationships, cultivating that trust. We have lots of passing interactions with people where we're not cultivating safety or transparency. They're just niceties, right? This is about really, really developing relationships and meaningful sharing of power in decision-making. I think this is the hardest pill to swallow for folks sometimes. And then Everyone Can Be Trauma-Informed, challenging hierarchical barriers. So in my current role, in my full-time job, I am an intern supervisor, or excuse me, I am a supervisor to an intern, and I also have an employee who I supervise. I don't like to think of myself as their supervisor, even though technically on paper I am. I see our roles as delegating it. It tells us what we're responsible for. So if there's a client emergency that someone has to work late, well, as the manager of the program, I'm probably the person that's going to do that. I might ask someone to help me, but it helps me know who's responsible for what. This is my bottom line. This is theirs. We all know what we're responsible for, and we're all going to do our work, right? And only very rarely, when it's absolutely necessary, do I like to, or maybe not even like to, but invoke the fact that there's a hierarchy there. Only when it's necessary, right? When important decisions have to be made, but I still want to know what people think. I don't want to make decisions on behalf of other people, whether it's our clients or the people that I work with or who work for me. Empowerment, voice, and choice. I hope it's evident now how closely these things weave together, because when we do ask people for their perspectives and value them and incorporate that feedback, when they feel included in decision-making, especially decisions that impact their work or their livelihood, it cultivates a sense of safety that they can speak up if there's a problem and that they will be taken seriously. Staff need to feel safe as much as people receiving services. It begins internally with staff. So the next time you're in a trauma-informed care workshop, if they're only talking about exam rooms, raise your hand and say, what about HR? What about the boardroom? What about the break room? What about the water cooler? Because it is not a patient experience thing. It is about staff first. When all voices, individual choices are equally heard, honored, and respected, this autonomy allows everyone equal opportunity to thrive. Trauma-informed practice promotes and celebrates autonomy. Remember in our definition in the beginning, we said it's a strengths-based modality. That means we're focusing on what people are capable of, celebrating those strengths and finding ways to harness those strengths within our organization. Maybe you didn't hire someone to do a certain thing, but it turns out they're really good at it. Maybe that means we shift people around or change responsibilities, or if they really want to do that, right? How can we harness people's strengths to the benefit of our organization and ultimately to the benefit of our clients and patients? An organization that runs really well internally, if we like each other, if we get along, if we respect each other, if we have a sense of safety among one another, we're going to provide better services to our patients. Have you ever been to a doctor's office where it was pretty clear that these things were not true and things seemed really dysfunctional, or there was a lot of tension between staff? People are not stupid, right? We pick up on these things. And then finally, key principle number 6, cultural, historical, racial, and gender issues. If you look at the SAMHSA document, you will find that the word racial is not there. I believe the intention was that it's implied by cultural and historical, but a lot of equity spaces that I've been honored to be a part of in the last year really make a point to focus on racial equity. And I think it's important to name in the way that systemic racism and specifically, the presence of white supremacy in our culture disenfranchises people on a racial basis. It's really important to name. And SAMHSA says we actively move past cultural stereotypes and biases. Policies, protocols, processes responsive to racial, ethnic, and cultural needs. And then in our second document, you know what? That's the wrong quote. I apologize. That one was redundant. You can see, actually, no, genocide, slavery, homophobia, and sexism have resulted in legacies that have prohibited opportunity, silenced voices, and prevented optimal choices for generations of both BIPOC and LGBTQ individuals and women. It's hard to argue with that. And so when we're thinking about the context in which trauma occurs, so hold on to that thought while we look at this next slide. So this is a quote from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. I had a major fangirl moment earlier this year when I was asked to be on a panel with Dr. Crenshaw to talk about equity and intersectionality. And so it was amazing to get to speak with her and hear her talk about this stuff. So hopefully you all are familiar with the term intersectionality. But Dr. Crenshaw came up with the term in the 90s to talk about, it was sort of a response to, we've got LGBT or queer activism, and then we've got racial activism, we've got feminism. But what happens if you're a Black queer woman? What happens if you're a trans woman of color, right? You can't parse out your identities. You're not one thing one day and another the next, right? You are all of your identities at once. So she writes, we tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. But what happens if you live at the intersection of both of them, right? And the sexism you experience is racialized, and the racism you experience is sexualized, et cetera, on and on. So we can't make assumptions about individual trauma based on identities. So I'm going to ask you to respond in the chat. I know it's a little tricky with the format, but let's see what we can do. So trauma might be cultural. Could someone please provide in the chat a quick example of what a cultural trauma might be? No wrong answers, by the way. It's a really, really broad topic. I need a water break anyway, so. Or if you can't think of a cultural trauma, what is a historical trauma? That might be an easier one to answer. Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, I think slavery is probably one of the clearest examples, both its, past and present, its legacy. So culturally, slavery as it impacts an entire group of people, right? It is difficult to think about African-American identity without the cultural context of slavery to this country. It's a historical trauma, having ancestors who experienced slavery, and also and then intergenerational. We'll talk about that in a second. Kevin says an example of cultural trauma would be the constant or consistent negative references to aspects of your culture. Yeah, so relative to talking about LGBT clients today, a lot of the anti-trans bias, a lot of state legislators that are taking up bills that would restrict access to transition-related care, much the way that we're seeing stuff in Texas right now, right? That is also a cultural trauma against people seeking abortion care and just bodily autonomy in general. Concentration camps, yes, I mean, the Holocaust is all of these things. Dorcas says, as a teenager attending to a private school, I had classmates who had introduced me to their parents as, she's Puerto Rican, but she's really nice. So thank you for sharing that, Dorcas. How terrible. And yes, that is a microaggression in addition to probably a traumatic experience that is difficult to explain to people sometimes. And then let's think about intergenerational for a moment. Let's say that you have, maybe you're the second or third generation from someone who survived a concentration camp. What we know about the neurology of trauma is that it changes how we relate emotionally. It changes what we share, how we navigate the world, how we respond to stimuli in our environment. If you have a parent who has lived through intense extreme trauma, it is going to change their relationship to other people, especially if it is trauma that has never been addressed, if they're just living with this horrible trauma they can't talk about, right? And that is not a criticism of people living with trauma, right? They are survivors of trauma, but maladaptive coping techniques. So it's possible that someone who's been through an extreme trauma, maybe they have a substance abuse problem, alcohol use disorder, right? A lot of people sometimes, I mean, substance abuse among veterans, we know, is a significant problem. And then those coping techniques get passed on into family systems, emotional systems, and it becomes intergenerational. We also know that your DNA can change through extreme trauma. Like, studies have been done that have shown actual changes that trauma can be literally inherited. Our stress responses, how we interact, how we respond. And sometimes it's all three. So another example of, I think, historical and cultural, think about the Tuskegee experiments, where demographics like Black men were guinea pigs and not told what they were being exposed to, being syphilis researchers that they didn't consent to. And this is not just a historical thing, right? As recent as in the past 10 years, we know that like prison systems in California have forcefully sterilized Black women who are incarcerated. So the abuse of people in medical settings and medical racism is not something we only talk about in a historical context, right? It's something that happens, unfortunately, in the present. And once again, in the chat, Dorcas shares, my grandmother was part of the US public health trials in Puerto Rico in the 40s and 50s. She woke up after giving birth to my mom to learn she had been sterilized without her consent. It's her experience that led me to my career of using medicine as a tool for social justice. Thank you for sharing that. And that is also a very good example, intergenerational, right? The impact that her experience had on you as a person, culturally and historically. So thank you all for participating in this conversation and being vulnerable with this topic, because I think trauma-informed practice requires a degree of vulnerability. Thank you for modeling it with us, and thank you for sharing. So this is a busy graphic, but applying those key principles. So we said that trauma is interpersonal. We've already named some of these examples. And this image is from Everyone Can Be Trauma Informed. There was actually part of like a week-long seminar work group where we were sort of fine-tuning some of the things on this graphic. But every time I look at this image on the right side of the screen, the multi-diagram one, I see something different that stands out to me. And so when we talk about trauma-informed practice, the thing we think about the most, at least from like empirical standpoint, is adverse childhood experiences, because the ACEs study from the early 2000s is sort of the foundation of all of this, that put all of this into motion. But so we can look at the overlap: individual trauma, family trauma, adult onset trauma, adverse childhood experiences. Many of the things that happen as adverse childhood experiences persist into an adulthood, or they experience widely as a community. So again, in the chat, if I could ask you, looking at this graphic, what's one thing that stands out to you that you perhaps would not have considered in the context of experiencing trauma until you looked at this and said, oh yeah, I bet that is really traumatic. One of the ones that has stood out to me, I will continue talking while you all type in your responses to my question, is natural disasters. I've seen a couple headlines where they've surveyed young people, and young people are experiencing a lot of stress about climate change. And as natural disasters become more frequent, I am wearing a sleeveless blouse on October 26th. It's like 69 degrees outside. That is not normal for October, right? Increased droughts, increased fires, increased flooding, all of these things. It's scary, right? Living through a natural disaster. Lack of health insurance, yes. Having to choose between whether or not you go to the doctor, poverty in general, right? And a lot of these things are centered around economic barriers or economic uncertainty, housing, food, right? And we know that people who live in poverty are more likely to end up incarcerated, right? Less likely to have secure housing, more likely to become homeless. And then the image on the left on adverse childhood experiences, this is from a CDC report on prevention of adverse childhood experiences for the current fiscal period, that again, we often think of abuse as being physical, right? Something happening to you, like direct harm being done, but neglect is traumatic, right? Witnessing a parent being treated with violence, young children living in families that have divorce. I see someone is departing because you have a class. Thank you for joining us and being present today. But so imagine that in addition to not having health insurance and not knowing where your next meal is going to come from, you have a parent who's incarcerated and you're experiencing emotional abuse. Those things compound, right? Much like that intersectionality piece of identity, right? These traumas are intersectional. It's hard enough having a parent who's incarcerated. It's hard enough not knowing where your next meal is going to come from, or not having the option of seeking medical care when you're sick or injured. It's hard enough to be physically or emotionally abused. But what if all of those things are happening at once? So I love this graphic. As somber as it is, it really just names it. This is also from the CDC. Mechanism by which adverse childhood experiences influence health and well-being throughout the lifespan. This is, I mean, it makes us think of Maslow's pyramid, right? Except this is sort of the trauma version of it. So we start with the foundation of generational embodiment or historical trauma. So thinking about the legacies of slavery or concentration camps, the ones that folks named previously. The social conditions and the context, right? We know that throughout the 20th century during Reconstruction, a lot of zoning laws and housing laws and other public policies in general were created to disenfranchise Black voters, African Americans, people of color in general, right? And then you throw in, like, what happens when you disenfranchise people through those laws? Well, they're more likely to be poor. They're less likely to be successful in careers, less likely to have good education, less likely to get well-paying jobs, right? More likely to make a wage that is not a living wage, which increases the risk of homelessness, which increases the risk of not having healthcare, which increases the risk of economic insecurity, which makes life really stressful, which disrupts our neurological development, which makes it harder to relate to other people. And we also know that people with 4 or more ACEs are like significantly more likely to have heart disease, to smoke, to engage in like very risky sexual behaviors, to live with untreated STIs, to have unintended pregnancy, to have poor academic performance, less likely to graduate from high school, all of these things. And so this one up here, disease, disability, and social problems, all of that, all converging into a shorter lifespan. Wow. Reactions to this. I mean, saying it out loud, it feels self-evident, but looking at it all spelled out here over the course of the last 30, 40 minutes, it's a lot, isn't it? So in the interest of time, we're going to skip through some of this. We have some more graphics. So what do we do? What do we do about it, right? This is also heavy. Well, SAMHSA provides us with the 4 R's. We realize the widespread impact of trauma. I feel like that's what we've been doing for the last 40 minutes, realizing the widespread impact of trauma, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. That requires a little bit more practice to see when people may be experiencing trauma or be carrying trauma. Responding by integrating knowledge about it and resisting re-traumatization. And so I love this, again, this Venn diagram. This is borrowed from a group called Koinonia, excuse me, because it's not always linear, right? They complement each other. You move back and forth between them. So again, it's an equation we solve. We don't take one workshop and then we're good at it, right? It requires intention. So again, in the interest of time, I want to get to some of the other slides we have. I'm going to skip some of this. But so the last thing that we haven't talked about is the implementation domains. So SAMHSA outlines these different domains for actually implementing it that are guided by the key principles. So if you were going to lead your organization in a trauma-informed care or practice shifting culture, the implementation domains would be where you would focus. And so this means shifting culture, and it can take 9 months, 2 years, depends on the size of your organization and the time of resources you can commit to make the shift. Guided by the implementation domains and requiring time, effort, and humility. And so this is not about exam rooms, right? It's about staff. We have to do it internally first. So I'm going to assume that you all know these words in the interest of time. I know we have less than 15 minutes, and I want to have at least a few minutes for questions. So, but sex and gender aren't the same thing. Cisgender and transgender are sort of antonyms, right? People who are trans do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. Cisgender people, if the doctor held you up and said it's a girl in your whole life, you were like, yeah, that's accurate. Well, congratulations, you're cisgender, right? And so we're gonna pivot sharply into thinking about what this means for working with LGBT folks. So cis and trans are Latin prefixes. Cis just means on the same side of, trans means on the opposite side of. When you see transcontinental airlines, it means on the other side of the continent, right? And so transgender on the other side of gender, it feels kind of clunky in 2021, but that's the etymology of it. And so these denote qualities of existence. They're not nouns, right? I don't ever want to hear anyone in my workspace say that she identifies as a woman. No, she is a woman who identifies as transgender. They don't identify as non-binary. They are non-binary, right? And so back to that implicit bias when we were talking about ageism, right? So we've got norms and we've got isms. Cisnormativity is when we assume people identify with their sex assigned at birth. The ism is when we consider, I don't know, a trans man less of a man than a cis man, right? Because they weren't assigned male at birth, because they weren't born with typical male organs, right? So identity versus being. And this is where we get into the weeds with healthcare. So there's this amazing concept called sanctuary harm. I could talk to you all about this for 2 hours. It's one of my favorite subjects. I discovered it doing a lit review in grad school, and it's like completely reshaped my practice. So implicit bias is sort of the individual where we might make a well-intentioned assumption about something, but when it becomes systemic, it's sanctuary harm. So, you know, we're here today as part of the School of Dentistry, and think about, so I know the School of Dentistry sees a lot of people, maybe dental students or folks who are able to see them if you don't have insurance or you can't afford dental care. A lot of times as part of their education, they perform dental procedures on folks who otherwise couldn't afford them. It's a great system. But so what if this is the only place that you can actually get a dental procedure that you need that's really important for your health? And the place that you're going, the only place you can go in town, happens to be really traumatic for you because they do not have a good system for interacting with trans folks. What if the only place that you can get an abortion in town, or the only place you can access hormone care, is not a pleasant place to go? You can't just walk across the street to the other clinic. It doesn't work that way, right? This ain't Starbucks. So when an institution who exists for the sole purpose of helping people to improve their lives, whether it's to take care of my root canal or to provide me with a life-saving medical service that I need, if you actually end up being disenfranchised and damaged by them because of re-traumatization, sanctuary harm has occurred. Could talk about this all day. So gender is a spectrum. We know now, we have solid data that like usually non-binary people are just a footnote. But we know now that non-binary people make up approximately 1/3 of the trans community. So over 30% of people don't strictly identify as male or female. You probably picked up, I don't like that word identity, but sometimes it's necessary. Genders outside of binary gender are just as common, right? That means that there is a 1 in 3 chance that the next client that you interact with who is a member of the trans community may be non-binary, agender, genderqueer, or something else other than a man or a woman, a girl or a boy, or male or female. We already mentioned cultural humility earlier as part of trauma-informed care. So we can't assume anything about people regardless of what their chart says. And if we do, we could be damaging that provider-client relationship or compromising their trust or safety. There's those key principles again, right? In our practice. So social work, my own field, teaches us that we should be constant learners, and that if we're not learning from our clients, then we're not providing them with optimal care, right? There will always be things we don't know. And to be fair, many of us have very important jobs where we require a level of expertise. And so how do we balance being experts in our field while also practicing humility, right? I was introduced to the concept of failing forward. Usually when we talk about equity work, it's like, well, what if I do or say the wrong thing? What if I try to do something anti-racist and I end up missing my mark? Well, trying is better than not doing anything, right? What if you try to set up a trans-affirming space and you get one of the pieces wrong? We can't be so afraid of failure that we don't do it, right? Because that doesn't help anybody but us, right? I love saying I don't know to people if I don't know the answer, right? To just free myself of the responsibility, right? And this other one, we can't assume because of our intentions, harm didn't happen. I'm telling you that the majority of harm that happens to trans people in healthcare settings is through well-intentioned ignorance. It's not malicious. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's extremely unkind, but most of the time it's well-intentioned and it's not malicious. Consider. Now, this data is cited from a 2011 study, but there was a 2015 one that found almost the exact same results. They were supposed to be a 2021, but well, nothing happened correctly in 2020. And then the stat in the middle is the one that just breaks my heart every time. 50% have had to educate people on their own providers about their care. And then 28% delay seeking healthcare when sick or injured. Yeah. So, you know, a lot of people are afraid of doctor's bills, ER bills, but most people, with acknowledgement to the fact medical racism exists, and if you are someone who does not speak English, that's its own trauma trying to go to the doctor if you can't communicate with the people trying to help you, or they can't communicate with you rather. But most of us don't delay seeking healthcare because we're worried that we're just going to be outright disrespected the moment we show up or share what prescriptions we take, right? Almost a third. So that means when trans and non-binary people come into your clinics, they have their guard up. They are anticipating this kind of harm to happen, and they have very low expectations. And it's our job to create a system that is worthy of their trust, that creates psychological safety. It's not enough to have good intentions. And so that same report from 2011 said that anti-trans bias in the US healthcare system has catastrophic consequences, a call to action for medical professions to fully integrate trans-sensitive care into professional standards. And SAMHSA's guide further emphasizes everyone who has patient contact must be well-versed. So I told you earlier, it's about all staff, right? It doesn't matter how good I am at my job if every interaction before they end up in my room is humiliating or awkward or embarrassing or uncomfortable, right? The damage is already done. whether it's the person answering your phone, right? Or scheduling, or the front desk, or your billing staff. It's got to be everybody. It's got to be everybody. And so when we think about cultivating environments, so accepting corrections, following leads, does your primary care provider ask you about your gender or your sexual orientation, your relationship orientation? Richmond has a lot of polyamorous people in it, and a lot of people are afraid to disclose they may be ethically non-monogamous. I bet some of the people listening to me say that have like an implicit bias towards that. And I say that just because I know that this is really common, right? Even in researchers, like among researchers, there tends to be a bias towards it. Do your intake forms account for differences, right? More than 2 gender options. And so we sort of rushed to this last portion. I skipped a few things, and we've got about 5 minutes left. And so if folks do have questions, I would love to chat with you real quick. And I was also provided with some questions in advance. So if folks do have questions you'd like to ask, I'm going to look at the questions Carlos sent me and just answer them real quick, and I will keep an eye on the chat. Also, Dorcas in the chat says, sanctuary harms is fascinating. Doing work with a larger urban hospital system focused on patient-centered care, we ran into a situation where we tried to be concordant with patient-physician, racial, gender, religious dimensions of difference for culturally competent care. We had an older Black male patient see a Black doctor in his room and say, "Oh, I'm not good enough for a white doctor." You know, Dirk, thank you for sharing that example. You know, that is a perfect example of when we think about resisting re-traumatization. So here what you're describing sounds like a really well-intentioned program that was very thoughtful about matching folks. And it's true that I bet we've all fielded a call from a prospective patient or client who have said, you know, I'd really like to see a provider who's also a woman, who's also a person of color, who's also Black, who's also et cetera, right? I have patients at my clinic, they really want to see a nurse or a doctor who's trans or who's, you know, LGBT in some way, if possible. And so a lot of people do like seeing folks who share cultural identities or demographics, right? Or racial communities. But it's true, not everyone is going to be okay with that or feel affirmed by that. And so that's part of that failing forward, I think, where we are doing the best that we can in a way that is really intentional, right? We don't just roll the dice and hope for the best, while also acknowledging that people are individuals and they're going to respond to things as individuals, right? We can plan the best we can based on what we know about folks. Hopefully we're doing that informed by members of community, whether it's through advisory boards, people in our workforce who share identities with our patient populations, right? But we're not gonna do it right every single time because people are complex. Thank you for sharing that example. And it can be discouraging. Yeah, I bet people in your clinic, Dorcas, felt very discouraged by that response after the work they did. I hope it wasn't detrimental to your program because it sounds like it was really thoughtful. We've got a minute left. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. Someone asked me how I got involved in education and delivery of trauma-informed healthcare. Honestly, it was part of my education and it was really relevant to patients I was working with. And I chose to direct things that I was working on to focus on that. So if you're interested in it and there's opportunities to incorporate it into your work, the sky's the limit. There's a lot of information that's already out there. And a lot of, I mean, the SAMHSA document is the best starting point, but really, really focusing on integrating it, right? There's no way you can do this after one workshop. There are things you can start doing today. There's things you can start doing next week, and there's things that are going to take a year, especially the larger the system you're in, the harder it is to make those changes.
I just want to thank you so much, Melissa-Irene, for being with us today. I don't know if there might be another question or two come in, but I mean, I knew you were going to knock it out of the park, but I mean, this was just so informative and so enriching. And I think really one of the things that I'm constantly pushing is the broad nature of DEI work and how DEI work touches really every segment of any person-centered interaction, any organizational-centered interaction. And I think the notion of trauma-informed practice, really in the scholarship around trauma-informed practice that you presented, really just, it leaves no stone unturned, right? And I think that's so very helpful to all of us, particularly in a health practice setting, right? Because there's so many touch points. I think there's so much here that even someone in private practice can begin to implement, or even if it's one thing that they lead with and say, okay, I'm going to start, you know, really thinking about the psychological safety of my team members, right? Or all those kinds of things. So it was so rich and so helpful. Thanks everyone for attending today. And again, thank you, Melissa-Irene, for everything you shared with us in the content.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Everyone have a great afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow for day 3, where we'll be doing a deep dive into microaggressions with consultant and practitioner Tamisha Williams. Thank you.
Thanks all.